Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 274. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you on with me today to talk Israel, immigration, surveillance, and Iran news. Lots of important stuff to get through on today's show. People can find the show at the Libertarian Institute, along with everything myself and Connor write. Libertarianinstitute.org. If you would like to donate, a great place to donate to what we're doing is through the Institute. We also have Patreon, Subscribe Star, and Accept Crypto. You can find all that information in the show notes page. We post the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey for the video version. And then on Twitter, the show is at con_interest. Another great way to support the show is by supporting our sponsor and buying your CBD at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com is the home to high quality CBD products. They have the lab tested results right there on their website. They have all the CBD kinds of products you could want. I really like the sports cream, but Connor, what's your favorite over at Paloma Verde?
I strongly recommend the soft gels. I like taking them after meals, and you get a real full spectrum effect. They come on in about like a half hour or so. They'll take away virtually any anxiety you got, and really, it's great for any kind of inflammation and pain you have, and it's going to affect your whole body when you take the soft gel. So whatever you got, whatever you're dealing with, you'll be able to get some relief from it. And then also very delicious and fast acting are the gummy bears. But mainly, I really still have to say the tinctures I think are just the best because it's the strongest stuff. It comes in great flavors like the mint flavor as well, and it lasts very long.
All right, thank you, Connor. Paloma Verde, CBD.com, promo code PEACE. That saves you 20% off and it gets the podcast a kickback. So it's a great way to help your favorite show. All right, Connor, start talking about the news today. And the first article I have is on a new report titled American Dragnet, Data Driven Deportation in the 21st Century. My article is titled New Report Reveals ICE spent billions spying on Americans. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement spent $2.8 billion to surveil Americans from 2008 to 2021. The new report is from the Georgetown Law Center for Privacy and Technology, details how warrantless mass spying tactics to deport people believed to have been in the U.S. illegally. The report found the agency could run images against a facial recognition database that includes a third of Americans and was quickly able to learn where hundreds of millions of people lived, all without any judicial oversight. In fact, ICE has used facial recognition technology to search through the driver's license photographs of around 1/3 of all adults in the U.S. The agency has access to the driver licenses data of 3 in 4 adults and tracks the movement of cars in cities, homes to nearly 70% of adults. When 3 in 4 adults in the U.S. connect the gas, electricity, phone, or internet in their new home, ICE was able to automatically learn their new address. State DMVs are vital to ICE in their hunt for illegal immigrants. Several states allow illegal immigrants to obtain driver's license, but also allow law enforcement to access driver's license data records seeking undocumented people to deport. And so this is from the report. 16 states and Washington, D.C. have allowed undocumented people to apply for driver licenses. However, in at least 5 of those 17 jurisdictions, ICE can warrantlessly search through state driver's license records for the purpose of civil immigration enforcement. In at least 6 of those 17 jurisdictions, ICE has used facial recognition to scan driver's licenses photographs to carry out deportations. And Connor, how nefarious is this, right? Rather than just not allowing illegal immigrants to get driver's licenses, you're going to allow them to get licenses, but then you're going to put their pictures in a database that allows immigration enforcement to run against it to easily find and deport these people. And I'm sure they don't promote that when they're handing out these driver's licenses. And so it seems almost like a trap, rather than some kind of benefit, parading as a benefit, essentially. Very, very nefarious, I think, here. The report also details underhanded tactics used by ICE to locate illegal immigrants. One method is for law enforcement to interview unaccompanied minors seeking asylum. During the questioning, the children are pressured to reveal the identity and locations of undocumented relatives in the United States. And so, Connor, one thing about our law system that I think is kind of important is distinguishing minors from adults. And the way we're supposed to treat minors is supposed to be significantly differently. Minors aren't supposed to be questioned by law enforcement without some kind of representation present. And so for a kid to show up on the U.S. southern border seeking asylum, they're fleeing because they, a lot of these countries, you hear the stories of either the young women fleeing the violence or the young men essentially being it's a conscription system, but it's gangs rather than governments, and so they're fleeing being conscripted into a gang because that's who has the monopoly on force in the city that they come from, largely because of the U.S. drug war. And so they end up on our southern border needing, some place to live where they're not going to be forced to kill or be killed or, be subject to that level of violence. And rather than at least give them the basic protection that you should give minors, which is allowing them some form of advocacy or representation, they're just badgering them for their mom, dad, relatives, locations so they could deport them. And we know the underhanded kind of tactics that police use. It's not like they're saying, well, if you give us your mom's address, we're just going to go and being honest and saying that we'll deport her. They're probably saying, well, we just need to know somebody's address so we know where to drop you off, and then you give your mom's address and you get her deported. And man, being like a 13 or 14-year-old having to live with something like that is, the cops are terrible. This is my problem with trying to enforce immigration law in the United States. Is just the tactics that you have to use are far uglier than any kind of negatives that you could bring up with immigration. And so, this is affecting all Americans. Though ICE has all collects all of this information. I'm sure the stuff that ends up in their databases they share with other law enforcement agencies, and anybody who lives anywhere near any American border is subject to immigration enforcement and surveillance. It's not like you're just people crossing the border. If you drive around anywhere near the border, hundreds of miles or 100 miles out or so, you'll start seeing immigration enforcement parked on the side of the road and stuff like that. So, Connor, anything to add on this?
No, just unbelievable to see all this. And of course, everybody wants to support all these different measures. But as you can see, obviously, it costs us billions of dollars, and it's affecting all of us. I mean, the statistics of the amount of data that they've collected on the vast majority of Americans is just shocking. And then, of course, everything else you said about how they're treating these people is just awful.
All right, Connor, very important story here. Israel murders Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. This is an Al Jazeera journalist who was reporting outside of the refugee/city of Jenin in the occupied West Bank. Second reporter Alid Samudi was shot and wounded. And I write this article at the Libertarian Institute. Samudi, who was near Abu Akleh when she was murdered, reported they came under fire from Israeli occupation forces without warning. He said, "They didn't ask us to leave. They didn't ask us to stop filming. They fired at us. One bullet hit me and another hit Shireen. They were in cold blood. They killed her in cold blood." And the bullet that hit him in the back, and he was wearing a vest marked press, but it was a bulletproof vest. So he is, I believe, in stable condition. There's some videos of him giving statements at the hospital. He doesn't appear to be in any kind of serious life-threatening injury, although you never know with internal bleeding and things like that, especially being shot in a bulletproof vest. In video showing the moments after Shireen was shot, both Shireen and a second journalist are seen wearing internationally recognized bulletproof vests marked press, PRESS, in all caps, and also bulletproof helmets. The video shows the gunmen continuing to fire on the journalist after Shireen was shot and killed. And if you watch the video, you can see a second man in a white shirt, just looks like a Palestinian who I guess lived in Jenin or the nearby area, and he jumps over the wall, tries to move the body. They continue to come under fire. He removes the second journalist, who gives a statement later on. She talks about how scared she was and how terrible it was, and how they intentionally targeted and picked out Shireen to kill. And then he ultimately moves Shireen's body, and you can see that she's very obviously immediately killed by this. It appears that she was shot in the face. The Palestinian, the Palestinian Authority, I believe, is the institution that carried out the autopsy of the body. They said they found a 5.56 round in her brain, and these are weapons that are used by the Israeli government. So obviously that fits. Immediately after this happened, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett disputed the narrative. In a tweet, he claimed Shireen was killed by Palestinians and added a battle as proof. This is from Bennett. According to the data we have at the moment, there is a good chance that armed Palestinians who fired wildly are the ones that led to the unfortunate death of the journalist. And look, anybody, Connor, who watches the video knows that these two people weren't shot by somebody shooting wildly. They were, shot and killed intentionally. She's wearing a bulletproof vest and helmet. This is a very difficult narrow shot to make. However, the prime minister's narrative was quickly disputed by the Israeli human rights monitoring group B'Tselem. The group concluded documents of Palestinian gunfire distributed by Israeli military cannot be the gunfire that killed Shireen, and they lay out a map here that you can see if you're looking, but basically it's I think over 300 yards from where her body was found, or where her body is where the alleged battle took place. There's no authenticity of that video anyways, but even if that video did turn out to be authentic, Connor, there's no sight lines from where Shireen was to where the alleged shooting took place. And so they also, I believe, have marked here, or maybe not in this, but I did see somewhere marked where the Israeli forces were, and that's very clearly within the sight line of where Shireen was. The Israeli government has backed off that claim some. Barak Ravid, who reports for Axios on Israel, said the IDF chief of staff, Aviv Kohave, said at the moment it is not possible to determine from which gunfire Abu Akleh was killed. And so, this isn't saying that we did it, but Bennett was initially asserting that was likely the Palestinians, and now they're suggesting, maybe it's 50-50. She is a Palestinian-American journalist. This is, I think very important, and should give us more of a chance to raise a big issue about this in the United States, who has covered the occupation for Al Jazeera since 1997. She was a household name in Palestine, described as a trailblazer and role model. And Connor, the best I could tell, this would be almost comparable to, a fairly mainstream media personality in the United States, not to insult her legacy at all, but maybe Brian Williams, or somebody like that, who's very recognizable, but who also goes on the ground out reporting. It's not like Sean Hannity, who just sits behind a desk all the time. She's out, she's been in Gaza through most of the conflicts, and at one point she was so renowned. I believe this was during the second Intifada. Her sign off at at the end of her broadcast, I'm so and so with so and so, was actually mocked by the Israeli soldiers. And so it's unclear, I guess, she is wearing a helmet and everything, if the Israeli soldiers who killed her were able to identify her, if they were targeting her specifically, or if this was just them targeting press in general. And so then after she was killed, Palestinians gathered at her home to mourn in Jerusalem. Mariv Zozin reports that the police arrived at her residence and demanded a Palestinian flag be taken down. I did see from other Palestinian sources, Connor, that they were not asking for the flag to be taken down, but rather for music to be turned down. But either way, it's, pretty insulting to do at a gathering of a mourning of a journalist at her home in the immediate hours after she death. I think it conveys the same level of disrespect, essentially. So, whether it's a translation issue or what happened, the Israeli police showing up after they killed her is quite bold. Now, the demand from Israel is that there's a joint Palestinian Authority Israeli investigation into this. The Palestinians have said absolutely not. I believe the U.S. has asked for a joint investigation as well. It doesn't seem like much investigation is needed here, Connor. Somebody who commented on my article said, well, we should wait for an autopsy. Anybody who watched that video knows that the bullet that went through her face is what killed her. That's pretty clear. It's hard to argue that. Now, my guess is what the U.S. is going to do, and I think I'm going to be right about this to a pretty exact level, Connor. It's going to take a week to a week and a half. They're going to come out and admit that it was the Israeli forces that killed her. Then they're going to issue a general condemnation against violence and sympathies and sorrows, maybe to the Palestinian people, but more likely to journalists at large and her maybe individual family. And then they're going to take out a $4 billion check, put it on the table, and slide it right into Naftali Bennett's pocket, right? And they're not going to cut the aid. It's going to be meaningless, very much like the condemnation that they issued last week. And so this is another article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, this one titled, U.S. Official Condemns Israeli Settlement Expansion, but Biden Will Not Leverage Visit to Tel Aviv. A State Department official condemned Israel on Friday in response to Tel Aviv's plan to add 4,000 new settlement homes. Palestinian groups responded favorably to this statement, but expressed that mere words were insufficient. Deputy State Department spokesperson Juliana Porter told reporters that the continued settlement expansion would damage the chance for a two-state solution. Porter said, Israel's program of expanding settlements deeply damages the prospects of a two-state solution, strongly opposing the expansion of settlements, which exacerbates the tensions and undermines the trust between the two parties. Now, the second part of this statement is true. The first part, of course, is just dumb because the two-state solution has long been killed by Israel. And at this point, I think the demand needs to be that the Palestinians are given equal rights. And yeah, of course, the U.S. leverages withdrawing our aid as a part of that and all of our support for Israel. But the demand really needs to be focused on equal rights. But she is right about the settlement expansion causing issues between, the settlers and Palestinians. Porter's statements come amid heightened tensions in Israel and the occupied territories. The AP reports that 18 Israelis and 30 Palestinians, and this was, I believe, as of Sunday, Connor. So the number, I think, is now about 34 Palestinians. On Sunday, 2 Palestinians were shot and killed. A 17-year-old was killed by an Israeli citizen, claiming the team carried a knife onto a settlement. Israeli forces killed a second man for attempting to bypass a checkpoint in the West Bank. The PLO and the Palestinian Authority, the PA, praised the Biden administration's condemnation. However, both groups said that simple statements weren't enough. The Palestinian Authority's foreign minister said that words were insufficient and do not rise to the level of crimes of settlement construction. The U.S. has frequently condemned Israeli settlement expansion, but does not attempt to leverage the support it gives to Tel Aviv to demand better treatment of the Palestinians. Porter indicated this would again be the case with Joe Biden saying the president's upcoming visit to Tel Aviv will be unimpacted by Israel's latest land grab. And yep, Connor, that's status quo. We say that it's bad. Now this is actually a little bit different from the Trump administration, I guess, but largely this has been the U.S. policy. So, Connor,
yeah, Nikki Haley would have been given the soldier whoever killed Shireen a pat on the back right now.
Yeah,
but it's de facto almost the same with the cheap condemnations and all this.
Well,
it might
it's
as
not,
well.
yeah. And at this point, we've seen Nancy Pelosi and Ned Price. Ned Price is the State Department spokesperson, condemn the killing, but not condemning Israel, right? So we're saying, and in a lot, it looks almost exactly like what I'm saying, right? Which is, the killing of the journalists is bad, and then a blanket condemnation for violence against journalists, not even violence against Palestinian journalists, right? Like they're just like, and so this is going to end up like being like, and the Ukrainian journalists and the Russians, and then Russia, and this is the way they're going to distract from this whole thing. So and this gets me to one more thing that I want to bring up on this subject, Connor, which is just this I think has another very disgusting but very important, and in some ways almost in its irony beautiful light on the disparity of the way the U.S. is reacting to the suffering of the Ukrainian people versus particularly the Palestinians, but largely the Arab world, the Muslim world in general, right? Everywhere from Libya to Afghanistan, Pakistan, the U.S. has just murdered and wrecked these countries, propped up the worst kinds of governments, and allowed the most brutal crimes, torture, murder, targeted assassinations, political assassinations. Hell, the UAE carried out a political assassination campaign in Yemen with U.S. mercenaries. I mean, name something that Russia's done in Ukraine that is more nefarious than that. So, all of these concerns that we see for the people of Ukraine, I'm not saying are unjustified and that we shouldn't care about those people. However, from the perspective of somebody in the United States, right, what my government does, what I can actually advocate for and maybe make some difference on, right, I could sit here and condemn Putin for 24 hours a day and nobody in Russia is going to give a damn. Putin's not going to give a damn. I can't vote in a Russian election. It's not going to make a difference. I can advocate for a change in U.S. foreign policy, and there is momentum behind the movement in the United States to interfere less in the Middle East. And so it's far more important for Americans to be condemning the $4 billion a year that goes to Israel, the settlements, the apartheid state of Israel, the war in Yemen, the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, the sanctions on Afghanistan, the millions of Afghans that the U.S. is actively starving, right, is far more important for the people of the United States to oppose than any stupid, meaningless condemnation of Russia and their invasion of Ukraine, because it means absolutely nothing. And in fact, the way the current politics in the U.S. play out, condemning Russia is in a lot of ways equivalent to supporting the U.S. proxy war against Russia. Now, I don't want to just make it black and white. I know that, everybody could condemn and should condemn what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Like, nobody should. I have seen some people come out and say, oh, this is a good thing. It's not. It's terrible. It's ugly. It's disgusting. It's war, right? But it's not in a war that the American people are aggressively waging, and to any involvement that there is of America, it's prolonging the war. There are real things that the Biden administration could do to bring an end to this war without a single person being killed. We don't have to have our stupid Aegis Ashore missile defense systems in Eastern Europe and Poland and Romania, Connor. We could withdraw those. Maybe withdrawing those would, Russia would be willing to take less Ukrainian territory, to, something like that, agreeing to end NATO expansion, taking NATO membership for Ukraine off the table. That means Lloyd Austin can't run around selling weapons for Lockheed, for Raytheon, also saying, well, one day possibly in the future, Ukraine could still become a NATO member state. I mean, this is directly against anything that could facilitate any kind of diplomacy. Or at the very least, if another country is looking at engaging in diplomacy with Russia or Ukraine, just hands off for 5 minutes, right? We don't have to pressure the Israeli government to take a more hardline stance against Russia if they're negotiating. We shouldn't be offering to sell Patriot missiles or ship free Patriot missiles to Turkey in placement of the S-400 missiles to send those to Ukraine if Turkey is facilitating diplomacy between Moscow and Kiev. It's just too important to have talks that could potentially end this war, saving lives. Less people will be displaced. People, they claim they're worried about food shortages, but are doing nothing to end this war. Everything going on from the U.S. side is to prolong the war, to open up new battlefields. And they're being quite honest about it now that this is about damaging Russia. And so, Connor, I know for like the first 2 months of this, it was just me and you speculating and, a few other people that was the policy. But now it's just outright clear that the American policy is no longer about even defending the people of Ukraine. This is an offensive war. And so, by condemning Russia and what they're doing in Ukraine, is fine. But if you make that the crux of everything you're doing, you are supporting that narrative and the U.S. proxy war. But, more importantly, back to this contrast, Connor, right after the invasion, we saw it with like the BBC journalists saying, these don't look like refugees, referring to the Ukrainians, and with for
they have
Ukraine,
blonde hair and blue eyes,
right? For Ukraine, these people are posting pictures on Twitter of how to make IEDs. If you had something like that even within a mile of you in the Middle East for the past 20 years, that was a death sentence, right? And now they're just showing Ukrainians how to make them. Now I'm not saying that that's a terrible thing, although IEDs are very ugly part of warfare. I'm not sure that even if you're resisting, it's a good path to go down. But anyways, the fact that it's promoted for Ukraine, but in Yemen, the fact that the Houthis use IEDs is half the proof that they're terrorists, right? Like, this is it's a death sentence for people in Yemen. That the fact that the essentially the ruling government, the Houthi there, employ IEDs to attempt to slow the advance of Saudi forces. That is considered terrorism, and we could wage a drone war in that country that goes on for 20 years. But if you look at Ukraine, it's completely applauded and supported. It's unbelievable. And I guess, from the Republicans, you can't really be surprised, right? No offense, Republicans. But from the Democrats, good God, you just spent 5-6 years lecturing every human being on this earth that you're a terrible bigot and racist. And if you have a Ukrainian flag in your bio and not a Yemeni flag and a Palestinian flag, I have no idea what your possible excuse could be. It's just despicable, Connor. And the fact that we're going to let, there's no way the American liberals would let the Democratic Party off the hook if they weren't sufficiently supporting the Ukrainian democracy against Russia. But you damn well better believe that not a single one of them is going to care when Nancy Pelosi, the State Department, Joe Biden do a single thing to in any even way to cut Israeli aid by $200 million a year, bring it from 3.8 to 3.6 billion dollars next year. They're not even going to do anything token like that in the least, and they're going to face no political pressure either.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, after the war in Gaza in May last year, where they killed approximately 250 civilians and dozens of children, destroyed like well over 10,000 homes, and this is a concentration camp they're bombing that's under blockade. The Biden, the Washington gave them another $1 billion on top of the additional on the regular since Obama, $3.8 billion America forks over to the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv every year. So they get in the same way of like Ukraine. Like we talk about something horrible happens. There's a horrible aggressive war, and but instead of trying to stop it or trying to, like you said, use leverage, which we have an abundance of with the Israelis, to ensure that the Palestinians are treated like human beings and not continually killed and dispossessed and having their homes taken from them and their land taken from them and being starved. We just give Israel another $1 billion to replenish the Iron Dome because it's so important. And as your point about AOC, I mean, it was a big scandal on the left that she voted present instead of voting no on that, when it would have cost her politically absolutely nothing, unless unless her constituency is not really the people that actually think she's like some sort of a, I don't know, element of true leftism in the Congress. Maybe she is eyeing the Pelosi position after she croaks or whatever, but at some point. But, I mean, the thing is there were memes going on last April where it showed, I forget the name of the journalist, but, it's some liberal blue check, right? And they're showing images of Ukrainian women making Molotov cocktails to use on the Russians. And the woman and whoever the lady was, she's like, look at these heroes. Even the girls are making Molotov cocktails. The heroes of Ukraine and all this. And they show how, I guess, either 2 or 3 weeks before or after, she has pictures of Palestinian teenagers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque preparing for yet another raid where hundreds of people are injured with tear gas and rubber bullets and flashbang grenades, and they're breaking the windows and hitting people with clubs and breaking bones. And they had stones or rocks that they were ready to throw. And then it says the same lady goes, in quotes, protesters, or in quotes, worshippers. So it just shows the huge hypocrisy, and people are showing like the State Department's responses to what just happened to Shireen, where after a journalist was killed in Ukraine, Ned Price goes off on Twitter and says things like, this is just another example of the gruesome, Moscow's gruesome rampage and indiscriminate murder in Ukraine and all this. And then, as you said, it's this very tepid, they don't even really condemn the Israelis nor even express support for Palestinian journalists in particular. And I was reading at Mondo Weiss this morning that since 2000, the Israelis have killed over 50 Palestinian journalists. Especially in Gaza last May, we saw them it was a massive scandal and horrible PR for them. And there were people defending it here. But they bombed towers that housed international media offices that belonged to the Associated Press and Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye. And so this is a very common thing. And yeah, I mean, it's just the one thing I will say is that hopefully, again, like with as bad as everything was last year, that again, this is there's no defending this. And the fact that I've seen several viral tweets going around of people talking about this story, sharing articles and sharing footage of it, that, they can't suppress this. Eventually the Hasbro is just not going to work. And I think social media has done a lot to devastate the official narrative on what's going on in Israel, Palestine. And, so I think people will definitely be motivated to do something here at this point, because most people have no idea what's going on there. And if they did, most Americans would never accept this. And the worst part of it, too, I'll just add to your point about everything else, is, we bankrupted ourselves and killed millions of people directly or indirectly as a result of the 9/11 attacks. But if you look at the policies like you're talking about, whether it's in Yemen or Afghanistan, starving potentially millions of Muslims to death, and continuing to back Israeli apartheid and occupation and their wars of aggression on the Gazans and the Palestinians and bombing Syria all the time. All these different policies are the same things that caused the 9/11 attacks in the first place. I mean, specifically, Mohammed Atta and the Hamburg Cell's motivation was U.S. support for Israel with billions of dollars in weapons and other financial aid. And he says that bin Laden said in many, many times that we see the Americans as responsible for the evictions and the violation of the sanctities and the killings that are carried out by their Zionist brothers in Lebanon and Palestine. And that is, we support all that to this day. It doesn't matter who's in office. Biden has been known for decades as Israel's man in Washington. And I also, as we we'll move on before I go, I'll just say you can't also separate this from what's going on with the Iran deal, because, I remember last May I think his
Wait, Connor,
name.
before we get to that, I just want to
Yeah,
mention the
sure, please.
headlines real quick, because then I'll just let you talk about Iran so we could tie it all
Yeah.
together. But the headlines real quick, a lot of the mainstream headlines were still, she died, right? And not even shot. Very few attributed to Israel. Some did, to be fair. There were a couple, but I felt like the New York Times almost did a bigger disservice to her than they did with Bad Daddy, calling him an austere religious scholar by saying that, she died at 51. I think anytime a journalist dies in the line of fire, you're doing their legacy a disservice if you are not even acknowledging that they were killed. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like
of course.
the way it was written, she could have been out there and had a heart attack or something. And so some of the headlines were really bad. There were even some that are like she died during clashes, which is completely unfounded. Like
Yeah.
she wasn't in like the middle of a firefight or anything like that. There may have been some things going on in the city, but she wasn't anywhere around it. But anyways, Connor,
The
go ahead.
eyewitnesses have all said that they're just everything I've read. The eyewitnesses say that there were no Palestinian gunmen in the
Yep.
area, nor Palestinian fighters.
Yep.
So the whole thing, and like you said, yeah, I mean, they could have shot. They did not shoot her in the chest. They didn't miss and hit her helmet. They deliberately shot this woman in the face, and she has been known. I've come to find out for quite a while now as the voice of Palestine, and this is I wouldn't be surprised if we find out this was absolutely deliberate. And also, I'll just say that Bennett obviously lost his parliamentary majority. You've covered that extensively on the show. And again, with the Iran deal, if you look at it's really hard to overestimate the importance of the phony Iran threat that justifies this unconditional aid that goes on for decades now since Israel switched sides and turned their old best friend into the worst enemy and the Hitler of the Middle East, the Islamic Republic. But yeah, I mean, I remember last May, what's his name? There's a guy on Fox News, Larry Kudlow, who hosts a show, Fox Business. And he had this, if Alex Jones had said this, it should have been laughed out of the room. But this is just put out on Fox Business. He goes, what's happening now with Hamas firing these rockets into Israel, completely leaving out all the context of what happened before at Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah and the evictions and the beatings of people and everything else that led up to all that. Hundreds and hundreds of people who were attacked. He goes, yeah, well, Hamas is working for their Iran as a proxy, who are on behalf of Russia challenging Biden by attacking Israel. So he goes, it's this and the colonial pipeline hack. But this is the kind of stuff we see in the media. And I'll just say that they use the issue of. I wouldn't put it past Bennett's government to be trying to provoke some larger reaction, particularly from Hamas or the resistance factions in Gaza, who have vowed that they will retaliate if these attacks on Palestinians continue. There were horrible, as I mentioned earlier, these raids last month on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and as you just covered, there's been an uptick in killings of Palestinians and violence. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if they do that because it could shut down all the talks for good. As we've seen previously, the Republicans always try to do that, seize on any opportunity. In the case of Israel starting a war, to go, now you got to cut off talks with Iran, otherwise you're a terrorist sympathizer and you're not going to defend our greatest ally and all this. But anyway, so basically they'll say that we can't make a deal with the Palestinians to get them, their human rights and allow them to be have equal rights in a single state, which is only realistically, like you said, one single democratic state until we deal with Iran, and you can't deal with Iran until we deal with Hamas, and then it just becomes a whole thing where the status quo is maintained forever. But anyway, so with Iran. Now, I wanted to make sure before I get on to the news of this week and last week, because I neglected to cover this on the last month. So on the 23rd, Al Jazeera reported that Iran and Saudi Arabia held their 5th round of talks in Baghdad. So there have been 4 rounds since April, and last year we covered this quite a bit, and it looked like it was the beginning of, a slow beginning of what could be ultimately some real rapprochement between both states. But they're downplaying hopes of it, or they're optimistic, but they're downplaying the idea that there's going to be any breakthrough soon. However, it was a meeting of senior representatives of the Iranian Supreme National Security Council and the Saudi intelligence chief. And Noor News, which is affiliated with the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, said that the main issues regarding reestablishing ties were discussed in a, quote, positive atmosphere, which, quote, painted a brighter outlook for future bilateral relations. And they added that talks could pave the way even for a meeting between the state's two foreign ministers. Oman reportedly played a role in organizing this latest session as well. And as they mentioned here, that so far the only major, visible, actionable outcome of these talks has been the reopening of the Iranian representative office at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. But that's still a good sign. And this is after Iran temporarily suspended talks with Riyadh after that mass execution of 81 people in March, where many Shiites were killed brutally. So, but it does appear that, I don't know, at least for the time being, there could be some positive things coming out of those talks that have been facilitated by Baghdad. Now, I have an article here from Jason Ditz from May 4th. U.S. prepares for nuclear compliance return without Iran deal. So State Department officials are floating the idea of just returning to a mutual return to compliance with the terms of the deal, the 2015 deal, that is, without a formal, agreement signed off in Vienna. It's unclear how that would actually work. And frankly, what Ned Price actually says in the Reuters report it's a little ambiguous. You could read what he's saying as him just saying that we're preparing for a return to compliance. We're also preparing for the deal just falling apart. At the same time, it is being reported that, because he says it's very much an uncertain proposition that they would return to compliance, but they are getting ready for that possibility. And as Jason says here, what the arrangement would look like, this mutual return to compliance in the absence of a deal, it's unclear. The U.S., of course, previously did not live up to its obligations under the deal even before Trump came into office, let alone when he pulled out of the deal illegally in May of 2018. So it's hard to see how this would work without a formal agreement. But again, Price did indicate that is a possibility. Now, now on May 5th, I have another one from antiwar.com here, and I've compiled some other reporting I found in Financial Times and Middle East Eye and elsewhere. But the U.S. Senate passes a motion barring removing Iran's IRGC from the terror list. Now, of course, this is, as we've been covering, the main issue that is there's still several issues on the table, it sounds like, according to the Iranians and the Europeans, but the Americans paint this as the solitary issue blocking. Otherwise a deal is there to be had, which was true until 7 weeks ago when this became something that the U.S. had previously indicated it was considering, but then they totally took it off the table because of the political poison pill. This was inserted by the Trump administration, part of people like Mark Dubowitz, the head of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, which is the most anti-Iran think tank in D.C., very powerful, held a lot of sway over the Trump administration. Dubowitz was talking about this in an op-ed, I believe, for the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago, when they really started ramping up the maximum pressure campaign in the wake of promises in early 2019 by Democratic primary candidates who were saying, oh, yeah, well, we'll return to the deal. We'll return to this is a huge mistake, and what an achievement that Obama had, which sounded good. People actually thought Biden would return to the deal. But the thing is that Dubowitz advocated building a sanctions wall that would prevent a Democrat from coming in and returning to the deal because of the political costs. So one of the main things, in fact, I think he actually recommended this specifically, was designating the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, the IRGC is already under myriad sanctions. It wasn't necessary at all. It's a massive insult, and it's prevented millions of Iranians who have been conscripted, and we talked about this last week, who have been conscripted into the IRGC They don't even necessarily, they could be doctors or people who are just cleaning up cafeterias or something. They still are going to be sanctioned. It doesn't matter, if they served in the IRGC decades before this FTO designation, they're still going to be prevented from coming into the country, even if they haven't served in any sort of military capacity for decades. And yeah, there's been reports. There was even a report of a traditional Iranian singer who was set to give a concert in Costa Mesa, who got stranded in Canada and was denied entry and told he could never enter, basically that he could never enter the United States. And one of the things is, by doing this FTO designation, what it does is they already had because the IRGC is under these I forget what it's like, globally recognized terrorist sanctions, these were implemented under the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, at the end of his second term, I believe. But they're also under sanctions for ballistic missiles and human rights violations, not to mention election meddling. Because if you remember, there was this phony I believe it was a national intelligence estimate put out, shortly after Biden came into office, where without evidence, they just said that virtually every country on America's hit list, and organization, like they even said Hezbollah attempted to interfere in the election to undermine Americans' confidence. But it was Venezuela, Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, all of this. So, so they're under those sanctions as well. But yeah, so I mean, but what it also does is this FTO designation also prevents, customs of other government officials who are in charge of immigration, these sorts of things. It removes from them the ability to even make an exception. They really don't have, the way this works is they are precluded from having that authority. So as far as basically. The Americans make this seem like it's the main issue, because that way it can be painted as it's Iran that's holding up the actual return to the deal, when in fact it's the Americans. But this is a very bad sign. So the Senate, Senator Richard Langford, he's a Republican, James Langford, excuse me, put forward this motion that basically bars, it's non-binding, but it says that the U.S. Senate will not support any return to the Iran deal that includes this delisting of the IRGC from the blacklist. Now it passed. It's 62 yes votes to 33 no votes. Now, Biden's administration, of course, already de facto ruled out removing the IRGC from the blacklist last week. But now this is a very powerful message being sent to Tehran and to Biden that any return to the deal will not survive senatorial oversight. There's other language in the bill that asserts that any new deal with Iran should include measures that strictly enforce the sanctions on Iran's oil trade with China, as well as their regional activities. 46 Republicans voted for the motion, along with 16 Democrats, including some of the Democrats that voted yes on the measure were influential senators like Chuck Schumer, Chris Coons, Ben Cardin, Joe Manchin. And this, of course, will let's see. So as another thing to note is that Rand Paul, again, was the only no vote in the entire Republican Party, although there were 3 abstentions. Chris Coons said, who up until recently was advocating that U.S. troops should be deployed to Ukraine, said that he still supports Biden's efforts to get back to the deal, but voted yes on the motion because he believes we need a stronger deal that includes measures against these are quotes, Iran's nuclear weapons program and many other malign activities. So that's where the Democrats are at right now. On the same day, 86 senators voted in favor of a motion introduced by Ted Cruz, asserting that terrorism-related sanctions on Iran's central bank and the IRGC are imperative to limit cooperation between Beijing and Tehran. Both of these motions were part of legislative talks regarding a bill addressing competition with China in the semiconductor industry. And Bob Menendez, of course, the very hawkish anti-Iran and influential chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has also previously demanded that Biden really step up the enforcement of these sanctions on Iran's oil trade with China. Now, Here we have another report. EU envoy heads to Iran to try to salvage the nuclear deal. So this visit is still ongoing. It's actually Enrique Mora, the broker of the talks in Vienna, the EU nuclear negotiator, is there for the second day of talks in Iran right now. Also, actually, the Emir of Qatar has arrived today as well to try and save the deal, and have other bilateral talks on bilateral and regional issues. Now, Enrique Mora is visiting Iran this week. Now, details I haven't seen really come out yet about what the actual results of the meetings have been. However, I do have quite a bit here on what is what they're saying they're going to be discussing and what the real political context of all of this is. So, basically, Mora is being sent there by Joseph Borrell, who's the EU foreign policy chief, to save the deal, because the Europeans really want, as Borrell has mentioned, I believe it's Borrell and not Mora. This was in the Financial Times. Yeah, they have a much more intense interest in seeing a return to the JCPOA from both sides than, and of course Iran is in the JCPOA. I just mean return to compliance with the deal. America has to return to the deal. But Borrell says that they really do have an interest now in return to the deal. He says previously it was kind of, he basically says that, previously it was kind of, oh yeah, it would be nice if we could if we could get the deal working again and revive it. But now he says it's of urgent interest because Europe could really use another crude supplier, what with the ongoing war in Ukraine and the sanctions blitz on Russia. And as we see, the EU is working on plans right now to phase out Russian energy. Now, he adds that the situation has changed now. And he also says that the Americans need a diplomatic success. Now, Borrell told Financial Times, the EU foreign policy chief, that he's seeking a middle way, that's a quote, to rectify the blacklist impasse. So he is reportedly considering a scenario where the designation is lifted on the IRGC, but it's kept in place on other ancillaries of the organization, which Financial Times says has several arms across the security apparatus and a sprawling business empire. There's also been suggestions by analysts that they could remove the sanctions on the IRGC itself, but maintain the sanctions for the Quds Force, which is the most elite part of the IRGC. I don't believe that that'll work. I'm sure that's a non-starter with the Iranians, and they've indicated as much already. Now, he did say he wanted also, there's a huge political consequence because before Hossein Amir Abdollahian ruled that out, he even just made a comment about, because the IRGC, the leaders of it have made comments that, if that's what's preventing a deal, then you know what, we'd be willing to just kind of accept that these sanctions, we remain on this list if it means sanctions relief and Iran getting back into and the US getting back into the deal. But Amir Abdollahian pointed out, how they weren't going to do this, but that kind of a sacrifice was very appreciated. But the political response from the Iranian media and the Iranian people was basically, how dare you? This is a surrender, not a sacrifice. And you were absolutely not going to do that. So it's, very, very, that's a real third rail for the Iranians, of course. Now, he says, Borrell said that his talks with Blinken have been exhausted, and the Iran file is on Biden's desk right now. Yeah, he said he wants Mora to go to Tehran to discuss the issue because he says Iran is very much reluctant, but this diplomatic push is the last bullet, as he put it. And but they also said that they're not going to give Iran an ultimatum. They're not going to be difficult with them. They're going to try and really find a way to save the deal if they can. Now, a senior U.S. administration official told the Financial Times that the talks will collapse if Tehran refuses to budge and rejects as well, quote, all the ideas that we have put forward. But all of they had proposed to the Rouhani government that, we might take that, we might remove that Trump sanction, and we could lift the FTO designation. However, this was all done in the context of these longer and stronger deal talks, which is what Sullivan had indicated was the plan before they even got into office. Basically, they were going to try and use the Trump sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign, as leverage to extract this essentially the same kind of concessions that Trump and his neocon advisors were trying to get out of Iran, namely the ballistic missile program and their support for their allies in the region. And there's many Democrats, a growing number of Democrats, who are making those same demands, which threaten, of course, the success of any kind of diplomacy here. And now, let's see. Now, another report I have here is Iran sells oil to Venezuela as Washington negotiations with Caracas and Tehran appear frozen. And this is Kyle's article from the Libertarian Institute. And so Venezuela has begun importing Iranian heavy crude oil as Biden maintains Trump's sanctions on both countries. Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, their documents show that 200,000 barrels of oil have been imported. 200,000 barrels of Iran's heavy crude oil arrived in mid-April, and a new shipment which was discharged last week. Bless you. A new shipment which was discharged last week was twice that size at 400,000 barrels and was discharged at the Jose port. Iran is also exporting, of course, the diluting agents to Venezuela, helping them to access their reserves. This is all part of a swap deal that has seen increased trade between both countries that was signed last year. And in fact, the Iranian oil minister just visited Venezuela and met with Maduro and his counterpart there to discuss different ways to avoid what they described as, and what have been the case, these unilateral coercive measures by the United States that have been seeking to disrupt the trade that they've been doing these last, especially in the last 2 years, or I'd say, 2 years. Now, the U.S. Let's see. So you also note here, of course, that the Americans have actually pirated these ships that have been going back and forth and have stolen Iranian oil. And in October 2020, Washington boasted that they had made $40 million selling stolen Iranian crude oil off of these ships. All right. And then I'll also note that there's another report here, IAEA, Iran dragging its feet in explaining undeclared sites. This is Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. From Tuesday. Now, the thing about this is we covered this in the last I want to say, but it had to be back in March. But recently, the documents were presented to Rafael Grossi, who's the chief of the IAEA there. But the thing is, these undeclared sites where they found trace uranium particles that are reportedly not a proliferation risk by any means. This is an issue that has been used by the Americans and the Israelis to basically thwart talks whenever they seem to be close to succeeding with Iran. And this was an issue that Iran wanted to basically get off the table for good, because it has been used to demonize them and to put them under a lot of diplomatic pressure unnecessarily. Now, they weren't legally obligated to provide all the documentation and the reports on the so-called undeclared sites and everything that they did do for Grossi, and it seemed good enough at the time. In March, I edited a piece I wrote with you about the updates on the Iran deal for the news section of the Institute, and I had a section in there about it. But once those reports came out about the deal where basically Iran would present, I believe sometime in June, documentation and a report on these particles, Grossi basically was like, okay, well, yeah, this has been settled, and then I'll present it to the Board of Governors, and we'll be good to go. So it seemed like a non-issue. So I actually excised it from the piece. And then Iran did present those documents way ahead of schedule recently. And I thought that was a very good sign. But now Grossi, as it appears now, we're getting closer and closer to everyone sort of admitting that the deal is just simply dead. Now Rafael Grossi is coming out and saying, oh, Iran was dragging its feet, which is surprising because, again, they weren't even supposed to have the documents at this point. He's saying that basically that they're being they're not being forthcoming, and he's extremely concerned about the situation. He even had some comments you can read at in the reporting on this at Al Jazeera and elsewhere, where he says, everybody's paying attention to Ukraine, but the real crisis right now is with Iran and these undeclared sites. It's just so, this is all just political posturing. Grassi has done this on and off throughout the last year, where in order to boost his own position and that of his agency, he plays politics and demonizes Iran as a way to I don't know. I mean, honestly, the Iranians have accused them of basically doing very underhanded things, let's say, and using some of these inspections as covers for intelligence gathering for other states. And there's even been questions about how these particles ended up at these undeclared sites in the first place. And there were even previously accusations that the IAEA may have had a hand in that. Now, I don't know that I don't believe any of that has been confirmed, but at the same time, Grassi is playing politics here and not helping the situation. And he hasn't really pointed out anything in particular that is problematic with the documents. He's just, like I said, he goes, they dragged their feet, which is patently false. They weren't even, like I said, they're way ahead of schedule. So at this point, basically from what I'm seeing here at this point, it looks like I think the Senate sent a very strong message to Biden that this deal, actually, I'll just add this, that the message the Iranians have gotten now is, previously Biden said, I can't promise you I won't leave the deal myself, even if you remain in compliance and we return to the deal. Like, before my first term is over, I could just leave. And that was a major bombshell when it came out. But now, with this increasing Democratic opposition to return to the deal in both the Senate and the House, I think the message that's being sent now is basically that even if you return to a deal under Biden, it will not survive. It doesn't matter what administration controls the White House or the or the Senate or the House. We are done with this deal. And frankly, any diplomacy with Iran is toxic. And in no small part here is that as a result of the work of the Israel lobby, like we were talking about earlier. And but there is increasing concern that if they do arrange some kind of loose truce without a deal, that there could just be, especially if Israel wants to, attack Iran with whatever manufactured justification they have, or if Iran leaves the NPT after they've been attacked by Israel and announces that they're preparing retaliatory strikes on U.S. partners or U.S. bases. Ryan Costello has a great piece about this at Responsible Statecraft and antiwar.com today. The problem really is here, as Trita Parsi has pointed out and we've discussed here, is that in any kind of a situation where Israel attacks Iran, and they are goaded through this process of refusing to return to the deal and refusing to lift sanctions and continually threatening them and encircling them with these Abraham's Accord states, they may be goaded out of leaving the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at that point, even if they don't announce that they're going to pursue nuclear weapons, it'll just be assumed that they have them, and we could see a war with Iran at some point. So obviously, hopefully that does not happen. But the Biden policy and his administration, which is, it was only a few months that it seemed like they might actually return to the deal, between the late December and March. And but for most of the time, I think we all saw, especially when we covered on this show, that Biden's policy was maximum pressure without the name. And so unfortunately, it looks like that's what they're going to stick with going forward. So anyway, hopefully that changes. But it looks to me at this point like the deal is all but dead.
All right, Connor, thanks so much for giving the Iran report this week. And you'll be back on the show next week. I have a lot of content coming out. I'm not sure when, but I have a speech talk that I gave at the Denver Libertarian Liberty on the Rots event. So I am going to put that out as an episode of the show, probably Sunday. So I got
Fantastic.
that to look forward to, and then I'll have to do another show on Russia soon, because there's a lot going on there, especially with Finland NATO membership. But anyways, Connor, thanks so much for coming back on the show, and we'll be back with more shows later this week.